A young man from Oshkosh, Wisconsin never once witnessed a battle during World War II, and yet he was present at every single one of them. Not as a soldier with a rifle, but as something the history books almost never talk about. Today, we're pulling back the curtain on the auxiliary surgical groups, the small, mobile surgical teams that followed the Allied armies all the way to the German border and beyond. By the end of this episode, you'll understand exactly what these units were, how they mirrored the structure of the armies they served, and why, without them, the Allied drive to Berlin would have stalled. I've got someone here who has gone deep into the record on this, so let's get into it. Walk me through what we're actually talking about when we say auxiliary surgical groups.
So the first thing to understand is that these were not your standard rear echelon medical units. An auxiliary surgical group was a small, mobile team, typically 2 surgeons, an anesthesiologist, a surgical nurse, and a couple of enlisted men, and their entire job was to bring the operating room as close to the front line as possible.
How close are we talking?
Within artillery range. The operational diary of Arthur Rehbein, a veteran of the 5th Auxiliary Surgical Group under the 9th Army, makes this explicit. Field hospitals in World War II were deployed within artillery range of the front. These weren't people sitting safely in the rear. They were operating in barns, in cellars, in shattered schoolhouses, with plaster falling from the ceilings every time a shell hit nearby.
That is a completely different picture than what most people imagine when they think of a military doctor.
Completely different. And Arthur Rehbein is a perfect lens for this story because he was one of only 2 enlisted men on his team. Everyone else was a medical officer, surgeons, and anesthesiologists, but the entire administrative and logistical weight of the team's deployments rest on Arthur and his partner. Tracking team movements, arranging transport, getting the surgeons to wherever the fighting was fiercest. That was Arthur's war.
So he's essentially the operational backbone of the team.
Exactly. And the record describes him and his fellow enlisted man as people who, frankly, should have been regarded as warrant officers given the scope of their responsibilities. But that's the Army for you.
Right. So let's gloom out a bit because the 5th ASG didn't operate in isolation. It was part of the 9th Army, and the 9th Army was part of something bigger. Can you set that up?
Yeah, this is where it gets really interesting. The U.S. Army fielded 3 armies in Northwest Europe, the 1st, the 3rd under Patton, and the 9th. And according to the record, these 3 armies formed what the diary describes as a functional triad: breakthrough, exploitation, and pursuit. And what's remarkable is that this triad was never formally written into doctrine. It emerged organically from the character of each army and the demands of the campaign.
So it just happened naturally.
It did. The 1st Army was the hammer. It bore the weight of the most difficult terrain, the strongest German defenses, from the hedgerows of Normandy to the Hürtgen Forest and the Siegfried Line. Its job was to break the line, to shatter the German defensive crust. The 3rd Army under Patton was the blade. Once 1st Army cracked the line, 3rd Army surged through with armored divisions at a tempo the Germans simply could not match.
And the 9th Army?
The 9th was the body of the prize fighter, to use the diary's own metaphor. It provided the steady, methodical pressure that prevented German forces from regrouping or establishing coherent defensive lines. It wasn't about dramatic breakthroughs or sweeping maneuvers. It was about maintaining a broad, unbroken front and absorbing German counterattacks while steadily pushing forward.
I love that metaphor, the prize fighter's body. It's not the flashy punch, but without it, the whole fighter collapses.
Precisely. And here's the part that I think is genuinely underappreciated. The auxiliary surgical groups mirrored that exact same triad. Each group developed its own operational personality shaped by the army it served. 1st Army's ASGs absorbed the heaviest trauma loads during breakthrough operations. 3rd Army's ASGs moved with extraordinary speed to support exploitation. And 9th Army's ASGs, including the 5th, provided the deliberate, methodical medical backbone for large-scale river crossings and sustained pursuit.
Wait, so the medical structure literally reflected the combat structure?
Exactly. The record describes it as a medical triad that paralleled the tactical triad at the front. And it wasn't accidental. It reflected the U.S. Army's growing sophistication in integrating logistics, engineering, and medical care into operational planning.
So let's get into what that actually looked like on the ground. The 9th Army enters combat in September 1944. What's the situation?
So the 9th Army crossed the Channel in September 1944. Long after the beaches had been secured and the breakout from Normandy achieved. It had no presence on Utah or Omaha Beach. It existed only on paper when D-Day happened. But here's what's interesting. The Ninth Army absorbed the medical lessons of D-Day before ever firing a shot. Its planners studied the bottlenecks at Utah and Omaha, the delays in evacuation caused by hedgerows, and the improvisations that had kept wounded men alive during those first fragile days.
So they learned from the chaos without having to live through it.
Right. And they adopted a model of mobile surgical grids, staggered in depth behind the advancing divisions, so that no wounded soldier was ever more than a few miles from a surgical table. The 5th ASG landed in Normandy rear areas and immediately began staging for forward deployment, establishing its first surgical stations in the wake of the fighting around Brest and later in Belgium.
And then they hit the Siegfried Line.
The West Wall fortifications, concrete bunkers, pillboxes, dragon's teeth forced the Ninth Army into a grinding, attritional campaign around Geilenkirchen, Alsdorf, and Verzelen. Casualties mounted steadily. The 5th ASG found itself operating at a tempo that the record says rivaled the worst days of the Normandy hedgerow battles.
What kinds of wounds were they seeing?
Traumatic amputations from mines, penetrating chest and abdominal wounds from shrapnel, and the slow, insidious damage of exposure as autumn turned to winter. Many teams operated in cellars or partially destroyed buildings where the thick walls offered some protection from shelling. Others worked under canvas in muddy fields, their tents shaking with each artillery impact.
That's a level of danger that most people don't associate with medical personnel.
And that's exactly the point the record makes. These were frontline units. The diary is unambiguous about that. And their proximity was the whole point. It meant hemorrhage could be controlled quickly, shock could be reversed, and infections could be prevented before they took hold. Without the 5th ASG's constant presence, the record argues, the attrition of the Siegfried Line might have halted the offensive entirely.
Okay, so then December 1944 arrives, and everything changes.
Everything changes. Mid-December 1944, the 5th ASG has its headquarters in Maastricht. The Ninth Army's front is stretched along the Roer River. The tempo is deliberate, almost clinical, exactly the kind of warfare Ninth Army specialized in. And then on the morning of December 16th, news starts arriving in fragments. A German attack in the Ardennes. American units overrun. Communications with First Army faltering.
The Battle of the Bulge.
The Battle of the Bulge. And at first, Ninth Army headquarters believed it was a spoiling attack. But by the afternoon of the 17th, the scale was undeniable. The German 5th and 6th Panzer armies had smashed into First Army's lines, and the entire northern shoulder of the American front was in danger of collapsing.
So what does that mean for the 5th ASG, which is sitting in Maastricht and not directly in the path of the attack?
This is the part that I think is really underappreciated. The 5th ASG's contribution during the Bulge was not defined by proximity to the fighting. It was defined by absorbing the medical shockwave of the German offensive. As First Army's evacuation routes collapsed under the German advance, casualties were diverted northward into Ninth Army's sector. Maastricht, Heerlen, and Sittard became critical nodes in an improvised evacuation network.
So they became a receiving zone.
Exactly. Ambulance convoys arrived in long, freezing columns, men suffering from blast trauma, small arms wounds, burns, and a shocking number of cold weather injuries. Frostbite and trench foot cases surged as the temperature dropped and the snow deepened. The 5th ASG's surgeons found themselves treating men who had been pulled out of collapsing aid stations, sometimes after days without evacuation. Many arrived hypothermic, dehydrated, or in shock.
And the surgical tempo became relentless.
Around the clock, teams worked in shifts, improvising space, sterilizing instruments, triaging with ruthless efficiency. The Ninth Army Medical Command authorized the use of any available building, schools, convents, warehouses, to expand surgical capacity. The record describes the 5th ASG headquarters in Maastricht becoming a coordination hub, tracking the shifting front, rerouting ambulance traffic, reassigning surgical teams to wherever the need was greatest.
So their mobility doctrine, designed for moving toward the front, got repurposed for catching the wounded flowing backward.
That's a perfect way to put it. And the record makes the argument that by stabilizing thousands of casualties, the 5th ASG enabled First Army to continue fighting. By maintaining Ninth Army's medical readiness, they ensured that Simpson's forces remained poised for the Ruhr offensive once the Bulge was contained. When the Bulge finally receded in January 1945, the 5th ASG emerged exhausted but intact.
And then they still had to deal with the Roer River dams problem.
Right. The Roer River dams were a strategic obstacle that shaped everything. The Germans controlled the flow of the river. By releasing water at will, they could flood the valley and render any crossing suicidal. Until those dams were captured or neutralized, the Ninth Army could not advance. So the winter of early 1945 became a zone of positional warfare, artillery duels, patrol clashes, small unit actions, a slow, grinding attrition that placed a constant burden on the medical system.
And cold injuries on top of combat wounds.
Frostbite, trench foot, exposure. Evacuation routes froze, thawed, and froze again, turning roads into treacherous paths that ambulances struggled to navigate. The 5th ASG adapted by establishing more sheltered surgical stations, often in stone buildings or deep cellars, where the temperature could be controlled and the wounded protected from the elements.
Okay, so then February 23rd, 1945, the waters recede and Operation Grenade launches. What happens?
Operation Grenade was a meticulously planned assault across the Roer River, executed along a broad front between Roermond and Duren. Infantry divisions advancing in assault boats under the cover of artillery and smoke, engineers constructing bridges under fire, and the initial casualties were severe. Soldiers drowned when boats capsized or were struck by artillery. Others were hit by mortar fire as they struggled up the far bank.
And the 5th ASG is right there.
As close to the river as safety allowed, operating from mobile surgical trucks, tented stations, commandeered buildings. Their tables were filled with men suffering from blast injuries, shrapnel wounds, hypothermia, and the trauma of near drowning. But once the bridgeheads were secure, the German defenses began to collapse, and the Ninth Army surged forward. The 5th ASG followed closely, often relocating every few days to keep pace with the advance.
Now, here's where the story gets really interesting, because there's this question of Remagen. Arthur Rehbein recalled being assigned to the Remagen bridgehead, but Remagen was a First Army operation. How does that work?
So, this is one of the most compelling parts of the record. At first glance, it looks like a contradiction. Remagen belonged to the First Army, whose organic surgical support came from the 9th Auxiliary Surgical Group, while Rehbein served in the 5th ASG under the 9th Army. But the deeper you look into the operational and medical realities of March 1945, the more the case builds that his recollection is not only plausible, but likely.
Walk me through the logic.
The unexpected capture of the Ludendorff Bridge on March 7, 1945, forced the First Army to sustain a bridgehead under continuous artillery fire, Luftwaffe attacks, structural collapses, and repeated German demolition attempts. The casualty load was immediate and immense. Men crushed under falling timbers, blown from the bridge by explosions, drowned in the Rhine, torn apart by artillery that bracketed the approaches day and night. First Army's own after-action medical reports described the situation in stark terms. The bridgehead required, quote, additional surgical teams at once.
And at precisely that moment, the 9th Army had just finished Operation Grenade.
Exactly. The Roer crossing ended on March 10th, and with the German line collapsing, the 9th Army's medical tempo dropped sharply for several days. Its surgical teams, including those of the 5th ASG, suddenly had a rare surplus of capacity. And they were geographically close. The 9th Army's forward medical installations lay only a short distance north of the Remagen sector.
So proximity, availability, and urgent need all lined up at the same moment.
And the record points to something else that makes this even more credible. The Army Surgeon's Technical Bulletin number 85, issued in April 1945, states plainly that during the Rhine operations, quote, surgical teams from adjacent armies were exchanged or temporarily attached as required by the tactical situation. The bulletin doesn't list specific teams, but it confirms the mechanism by which such detachments occurred.
So this wasn't some exceptional workaround, it was standard practice.
Standard practice. And there's a reciprocity angle here, too. The record notes that the 9th ASG, assigned to the First Army, had earlier been attached to support the 9th Army during Operation Grenade. So when the bridge at Remagen was unexpectedly captured intact, reciprocity would have been expected.
And the absence of a written order doesn't mean it didn't happen.
That's the key point. Auxiliary surgical groups operated with a degree of administrative informality that reflected their mobility. Detachments were often issued verbally at corps or army surgeon level, recorded in temporary logs, or filed in documents that were never archived after the war. The record puts it well. The absence of a paper trail is not evidence of absence. It's a predictable artifact of how these units functioned.
And there are other veteran accounts that support this pattern.
Members of the 5th ASG independently described temporary assignments to First Army clearing stations, emergency reinforcement of river crossings, and ad hoc attachments during periods of intense combat. These recollections appear in oral histories, unpublished memoirs, and VA interviews. They form a pattern. The 5th ASG was not confined to 9th Army's sector when medical necessity demanded otherwise.
The Valkyrie flew where they were most needed.
That's actually the phrase the record uses. And I think it captures something important about how these units understood their own mission. They weren't bureaucratic. They went where the dying were.
Speaking of which, that Valkyrie metaphor is worth sitting with for a second. Norse mythology, figures who chose who lived and died on the battlefield. It's a striking way to frame what these surgical teams actually did.
It is, and the record uses it deliberately. The Valkyrie didn't watch from a distance, they intervened at the crux of battle. And that's exactly what the ASGs did. They didn't wait for the wounded to come to them. They positioned themselves so that the wounded didn't have to travel far to reach them. That proximity was the difference between life and death in an era before helicopters.
Which brings up something I find genuinely fascinating. The modern military code of no man left behind, that's actually a product of helicopter technology, right?
The record makes exactly that point. Since the invention of the helicopter, medical corps have been placed at safer distances from the action. In Arthur's day, that code wasn't necessary because the surgical teams deployed into the fray. The angels of the battlefield, as the record calls them, were already there. The helicopter changed the calculus entirely. It made it possible to deliver medical aid from the secure rear, which is safer for the medics but means the wounded have to survive long enough to be evacuated.
So in a weird way, the ASG model was actually more aggressive about saving lives in the moment.
That's a fair reading. The trade-off is risk to the medical personnel, and the ASGs accepted that risk. They were within artillery range, they were in buildings that were shaking from shell impacts. Arthur Rehbein himself was pressed into service in the surgical suite at Remagen, one of the most terrifying moments of the war, by his own account.
Let's talk about what comes after Remagen, Operation Plunder, the Rhine crossing. What does the 5th ASG face there?
Operation Plunder was one of the most complex and powerful river-crossing operations of the war. The Ninth Army's role was to assault the southern portion of the crossing zone, while British and Canadian forces attacked to the north. Massive artillery bombardment, amphibious crossings, pontoon bridge construction under fire, and the airborne assault known as Operation Varsity. The airborne divisions suffered heavily as they landed among German flak batteries and scattered defensive positions.
And the 5th ASG experienced its heaviest operational tempo of the entire war during those days.
Continuous surgery on the wounded from both the river assault and the airborne landings. But despite the intensity, the Ninth Army's crossing succeeded with remarkable speed. Once across the Rhine, the German defenses crumbled. The 5th ASG moved forward again, establishing new surgical stations on the east bank as the Ninth Army began its final drive into the heart of Germany.
And then the Ruhr Pocket, which is the Ninth Army's crowning achievement according to the record.
The encirclement of the Ruhr was massive. As the Ninth Army drove south and the First Army drove north, the two forces closed a pincer around Army Group B, trapping more than 300,000 German soldiers in the industrial heartland of the Reich. The fighting inside the pocket was fierce but disorganized, as German units attempted to break out or surrender in large numbers.
And for the 5th ASG, this presented a completely new kind of medical challenge.
A humanitarian crisis on top of a combat crisis. The collapse of German medical infrastructure meant that thousands of wounded German soldiers, along with civilians injured in the fighting, required immediate care. The industrial cities of the Ruhr, Essen, Dortmund, Bochum were filled with rubble, fires, and displaced civilians. The 5th ASG treated not only combat casualties, but also victims of starvation, disease, and industrial accidents caused by the breakdown of civil order.
So they're treating German POWs and civilians in the same facilities as American wounded.
Side by side. And the record frames this as the humanitarian dimension of the ASG mission. Once the enemy surrendered, he became a patient, and the duty to preserve life superseded all other considerations. That's a remarkable thing to hold on to in the middle of a war.
And then the final advance to the Elbe.
After the Ruhr Pocket collapsed, the Ninth Army advanced rapidly across central Germany. Resistance was minimal. Most German units were either surrendering or retreating toward the Soviets. The Ninth Army halted at the Elbe River in accordance with SHAEF orders, leaving the final assault on Berlin to the Red Army. And during this final phase, the 5th ASG shifted from combat surgery to humanitarian medicine, stabilizing forced laborers, concentration camp survivors, and displaced persons suffering from malnutrition, infectious disease, and untreated injuries.
So the war ends and the 5th ASG is still working.
Still working. By the time VE Day arrived, the 5th ASG had performed thousands of operations, saved countless lives, and contributed immeasurably to the Ninth Army's ability to maintain its relentless advance. And the record notes that its innovations in forward surgery, mobility, and trauma care influenced post-war military medicine and laid the groundwork for the surgical systems used in Korea, Vietnam, and beyond.
Which is where the MASH unit concept comes from, the Mobile Army Surgical Hospital that most people know from the TV show. That lineage runs directly through what the ASGs were doing in World War II.
Directly. The principle is the same. Bring the surgery forward. Don't wait for the wounded to come to you. The ASGs proved that model worked under the most extreme conditions imaginable, and the Army never forgot that lesson.
So when you step back from everything we've covered, the triad of armies, the triad of surgical groups, Arthur Rehbein in Maastricht during the Bulge, the Remagen bridgehead, the Ruhr pocket, what's the through line here?
The through line is that the medical triad was as decisive as the tactical one. The record makes this argument explicitly. Without the ASGs, the breakthroughs would have faltered, the exploitation would have stalled, and the pursuit would have been unsustainable. The warfighters of the 1st, 3rd, and 9th Armies found the courage to throw themselves into the fight precisely because the surgical teams were riding into the storm beside them.
And yet most histories of World War II don't tell this story.
Most histories focus on the combatants. The record acknowledges that directly. It says, most histories neglect the daily heroics of the medical corps. And there's something almost poetic about the fact that Arthur Rehbein himself refuses any notion that he's a hero. But the record pushes back on that. Every wounded soldier who made it home owes something to the people who were there with a surgical table when it mattered most.
Here's what this really comes down to, I think. We tend to measure military success in terms of ground taken, bridges seized, pockets encircled. But the Allied drive to Berlin was also sustained by something much quieter. Teams of a half-dozen people operating in cellars and barns and muddy fields, making the decision over and over again that this person gets to live.
And making that decision under artillery fire, in freezing temperatures, with instruments they'd sterilized in shifts, in buildings they'd commandeered an hour before. The operational sophistication of the ASG system, the mobile surgical grids, the cross-army detachments, the ability to shift from combat surgery to humanitarian medicine almost overnight, that's not a footnote to the Allied campaign. That's part of what made the campaign possible.
And Arthur Rehbein, a kid from Oshkosh who had been planning to go into banking, who was listening to his pocket radio when he heard about Pearl Harbor, he ends up being one of the people holding that system together.
He and thousands like him. The record notes that 96% of his graduating class entered national service. 7 of his classmates were killed in action. And Arthur's contribution was to make sure that number didn't grow, not by carrying a rifle, but by making sure the surgeons got where they needed to go, and that the wounded got to the surgeons.
Remember how we opened, a young man from Oshkosh who never witnessed a battle, but was present at every one of them. That's not a contradiction, that's the whole story. He was there for all of it. The Siegfried Line, the Bulge, Remagen, the Rhine, the Ruhr, not in the foxhole, but in the operating room next to it. And the Allied drive to Berlin moved forward, in part because he showed up. The next time someone tells you the war was won by the generals and the tank commanders, you'll know there were also 2 enlisted men in a jeep, driving surgeons toward the sound of the guns.